My life has been a gift, and I do try to.
In the spring of 1960, Andy Griffith was the most beloved man in America. His face was warm, his smile was unhurried, and his voice carried the particular gentleness of someone who had never known a hard day. That was what the country believed. But behind the sheriff of Mayberry, behind that masterfully constructed portrait of small-town grace, lived a man still running from a hollow in North Carolina where a child once pressed himself against walls to avoid being noticed. And the most devastating detail? The warmth that made the whole world trust him. The same warmth that would later define Return to Mayberry and every Andy Griffith reunion was something he had invented entirely to survive. There is an irony in Andy Griffith's story that hurts too much to be coincidence. The child who grew up in poverty so acute that Christmas meant an orange and a handful of nuts, nothing more. The teenager who discovered that music and performance could transform invisibility into presence. That a boy nobody wanted to look at could make an entire room go still just by opening his mouth. The man who built an empire out of folksy humor with pieces like What It Was Football, Gentle Wisdom, and the performance of a warmth so convincing it felt like truth. All of that so that fame would arrive and reveal that the warmth was the mask, and underneath it, Andy Griffith had never quite learned how to simply be still. So how does a boy from a forgotten mill town become the face of American innocence? What was the private architecture of a man the public considered effortlessly good? What happens when the very performance that saves you also becomes the cage you cannot leave? And what does a man do when the character he played for decades feels more real than the man who played him? When people ask what happened to Andy Griffith's wife on the show, but never think to ask what happened to the man behind the camera. To understand all of that, we need to go back to the beginning, to Mount Airy, North Carolina, to June the 1st, 1926, and to a boy who learned, in the cruelest way possible, that the only way to be loved was to become someone else entirely. Mount Airy sat in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains like something the rest of the world had simply forgotten to collect. Gray streets, mill smoke, the particular silence of places where ambition is considered a form of rudeness. Carl Lee Griffith worked as a furniture maker, a man of few words and careful economy. Not cold exactly, but contained in the way that men of that era and that class were trained to be. Geneva Griffith, Andy's mother, carried the household's emotional temperature alone. Warm where her husband was measured, hopeful where their circumstances were not. Andy Samuel Griffith was born into that careful world as an only child, which in the language of that time and place meant something specific. It meant there was no buffer, no sibling to absorb the weight of expectation or the silence at the dinner table. There was no luxury, no industry connections, no paved road to anything beyond the mill. But there was something more powerful than all of that. There was a child who felt the world too intensely and had absolutely nowhere to put it. The wound was not a single event. It was the slow accumulation of a particular kind of childhood pain, the pain of being overlooked. Andy was not a natural among other children. He was awkward, large for his age in the wrong ways, uncertain in social situations that other boys seemed to navigate without thinking. He was not the kind of child who walked into a room and made it easier. He was the kind who made it complicated simply by existing. In school, the distance between him and his classmates felt geological. He later described the feeling in an Andy Griffith interview not as bullying exactly, but as irrelevance, which is its own specific cruelty. He absorbed that irrelevance with a child's particular thoroughness. He learned that to need people openly was to hand them something they could use against you. He learned that the safest version of himself was the version that stayed slightly behind the surface, observing, cataloging, performing only when performance meant control. He built a private internal life of extraordinary richness and shared almost none of it. He would watch other families, other boys, the way a director might study a scene, learning the mechanics of warmth without ever quite feeling it himself. Years later, in an Andy Griffith interview that made the room go quiet, Griffith would say with a voice carrying the specific weight of someone confessing a thing they had never quite said aloud, I was not a happy child. I was not at ease. I always felt like I was on the outside of something everyone else understood naturally. At 14, something happened that briefly closed the only door Andy believed might lead somewhere. He had begun to imagine a future in music, had taught himself the guitar with the obsessive focus of a boy who had found the one language that did not humiliate him. But the family's financial situation contracted further, and the possibility of any formal training, any structured path towards something better, collapsed without ceremony. For most boys in Mount Airy, this would have been the quiet end of a quiet dream. For Andy Griffith, it was something else. It was the moment desperation became direction. With the first door closed, he found a second one through the church. It was not a dramatic discovery. There was no spotlight, no audience waiting. There was only a preacher named Ed Mickey who recognized something in the teenager and began teaching him to sing formally, to use his voice as instrument rather than accident. Andy joined the Glee Club. He began to perform in small church productions, in school plays, in any context that allowed him to stand in front of people and become, briefly, legible to them in a way ordinary life had never permitted. And when Andy Griffith stood on a stage for the first time and felt the room shift toward him, something inside him that had been clenched since childhood released, just slightly, just enough. The awkward boy disappeared. The stutter in his social interactions vanished when he inhabited someone else's words, someone else's confidence. It was not talent yet. It was recognition, the silent, absolute certainty of having found the place where he belonged. On that improvised stage, performing scenes that would later echo in episodes like Andy Griffith The Haunted House or Andy Griffith Romeo and Juliet, he was free. Only Andy Griffith was free when pretending to be someone else. At 19 years old, with barely $300 in his pocket and a cardboard suitcase containing everything he owned, Andy Griffith arrived in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. He had won a scholarship to the University of North Carolina, a miraculous door that had opened because someone had finally seen what the boy from Mount Airy had learned to hide so perfectly. No contacts, no safety net, no backup plan except the absolute certainty that if he stayed in that mill town one more year, something inside him would calcify permanently. Chapel Hill in 1944 was not kind to boys who carried poverty like a stain they could never quite wash away. It was a place that ground down insecurity slowly, with the cold indifference of a town that had already seen too many young people arrive with hunger in their eyes and leave with empty hands. But Andy Griffith was not like most. He had already learned the most essential skill of survival. He knew how to become what people needed him to be. He washed dishes in the university dining hall. He loaded boxes. He worked nights while studying days, and in every exhausted hour, he saved something no one could take away, the certainty that performance was his only currency that mattered. He joined the drama department almost by accident, through a friend's casual invitation, the way many transformative moments arrive in life, disguised as nothing important. But when he stepped onto that university stage and performed in his first real theatrical production, something extraordinary happened. The poverty vanished. The awkwardness transformed. The boy who had felt invisible his entire life suddenly commanded the attention of an entire auditorium. After graduation, he moved to New York with the same desperate determination. Casting after casting, the door slammed in his face. Broadway rejected him repeatedly. Off-Broadway theaters told him his appearance was strange, his accent unmarketable, his type too specific. 100 auditions, 120 rejections. But Andy Griffith carried something deeper than talent. He carried a wound so profound that it had no choice but to transform into an art form. He carried the understanding that every character he played was a chance to be someone other than the boy nobody wanted. In 1953, at 27 years old, something shifted. He was cast in a small television role, and then another, and then in 1954, he performed a monologue called What It Was Football on a television show that no one particularly noticed. But in that monologue, something happened. The warmth, the humor, the particular gentleness of his voice became visible for the first time. It was not acting. It was alchemy. He had transformed his deepest wound into his greatest gift. The role that changed everything came in 1960. The Andy Griffith Show premiered on October 3rd to modest expectations. The network executives thought it was a risk. A show set in a small town. A sheriff who preferred conversation to violence. A man who seemed to possess an almost preternatural kindness. But America was ready for something it did not yet know it needed. The show exploded. Within weeks, it was the #1 program in America. Within months, it became the most beloved television program the country had ever seen. Every week, millions of people invited Andy Griffith into their living rooms. They watched him navigate small-town problems with a wisdom that seemed to come from somewhere deep and true. They watched him as Sheriff Andy Taylor as the moral center of a fictional Mayberry that began to feel more real than reality itself. And they loved him not just as a character, but as a promise. A promise that goodness was possible, that patience was power, that the world could be gentle. But here is what nobody saw. Here is what the return to Mayberry specials and the Andy Griffith reunion appearances could never quite capture. Behind the set, Andy Griffith was running. He was running from the performance he had constructed so perfectly that it had become impossible to step out of. He was running from the fact that the warmth people loved was not something he felt, but something he had learned to display with such precision that it had become indistinguishable from authenticity. His marriage to Barbara Bray Edwards lasted from 1949 to 1972, 23 years, and by the end of it, something had fractured beyond repair. What happened to Andy Griffith's wife on the show became a question people asked endlessly, but no one thought to ask what was happening to Andy Griffith himself. The performance had consumed him. The man had been subsumed entirely by the character. There were nights when he could not remember which version of himself was real anymore. The show ran for 8 seasons, and with each season, Andy Griffith felt something inside him dying. The very performance that had saved him was now suffocating him. He could not walk down a street without being Sheriff Taylor. He could not have a private moment because the public had decided they owned him. He had given everything to create a character of such completeness that there was nothing left of Andy Griffith the man. But what makes a human being extraordinary is not the absence of breaking. It is what they do after the break. After the show ended in 1968, Andy Griffith did something unexpected. He did not cling to Mayberry. He did not perform endless nostalgia. Instead, he reinvented himself again, this time as an actor willing to take on darker, more complex roles. He became Matlock. He became a man willing to show the shadows he had hidden for so long. In 1981, at 55 years old, Andy Griffith married Cindy Knight, a woman 24 years his junior. And in her presence, people who knew him began to report something remarkable. They said he seemed lighter. They said the performance, for the first time, seemed to have a human being inside it. The Andy Griffith reunion specials that came later, including Return to Mayberry, which aired in 1986 and captured millions of viewers desperate to return to that fictional town one more time, showed something different. They showed a man who had made peace with the character he had created. They showed Sheriff Taylor grown older, wearier, but still carrying the same quiet wisdom. And in that wisdom, finally, was something true. Andy Griffith lived to 96 years old. He passed away on July 3, 2012, leaving behind an empire of performance, of television, of the particular American mythology he had helped to create. But more than that, he left behind proof of something essential. He proved that you do not need to begin with privilege to become iconic. You need only the willingness to bleed your wounds into something that might heal the world watching you. From the overlooked child to the greatest television star of his generation, Andy Griffith's legacy teaches us that sometimes the performance saves your life. And sometimes, learning to live beneath the performance saves it again.